whenever you're ready, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Diana Nasser, and I teach grade 9 world history at Bethel High School.
Okay, good. For you.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I'm recording, and that's your eye line up there, and I'm going to be kind of looking at everything here. Okay, that looks good. Okay, first question. We want to understand the decisions you made in planning for this lesson and how it fits into the unit and year. How does this lesson connect to and build on students' prior skills and knowledge? What was taught before this lesson and what will come after it?
Prior to this lesson that I taught on the Enlightenment, students had already worked on annotating different primary source texts that were very content-rich and full with challenging vocabulary. We spent a lot of time looking over the different words that were in the documents, and we also identified some strategies for taking effective annotations. Students also worked on
You want to take
Sorry.
a pause there?
Yeah, I need to take a pause.
It's a good time.
Sorry.
Okay. So, how does this lesson connect to and build on students' prior skills and knowledge? What was taught before this lesson and what will come after it?
Prior to this lesson, students read, annotated, and analyzed 3 primary sources. 2 of the sources were written documents that were primary sources from the Age of the Enlightenment. And the other source was a video source that was part of a TED Talk. I need to pause.
Mike. Hey, I'm getting good at it at this point. Okay. How does this lesson connect to and build on students' prior skills and knowledge? What was taught before this lesson and what will come after it?
Prior to this lesson, students read, annotated, and analyzed 3 sources relating to the concepts of the Age of Enlightenment. 2 of the sources were content-rich. They were primary sources that were directly from the Age of Enlightenment. And they were Immanuel Kant's What is Enlightenment and Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Emile. The 3rd source was a video from a TED Talk, which was an animation of Ken Robinson's Changing Educational Paradigms. The students had worked with these 3 sources to review their annotations and then to also develop text-dependent questions. Leading into this lesson, the class before, they had analyzed the complexity of their questions to really evaluate how rich their questions are and whether their questions were going to yield different types of responses.
Good. Is the text used in this lesson part of a sequence of text designed to build skills and knowledge? If so, please give example of other texts that form this sequence.
The texts that I used for this lesson were content-rich. They focused on the different elements and enduring themes and essential understandings of the Age of Enlightenment. They also included very content-specific vocabulary that students needed to analyze and apply to their learning as they continued throughout the unit. The Ken Robinson video, the animation of his Changing Educational Paradigms, was to draw the concepts of the Enlightenment to changes happening today in the educational system. So essentially, the texts all interconnected and were synthesized to this greater understanding of how was the Enlightenment a revolution of thought.
Talk about the standards targeted in this lesson. What did you do to make the lesson reflect the full?
I need to pause for that.
Okay.
Sorry.
Not a problem. Talk about the standards targeted in this lesson. What did you do to make the lesson reflect the full intent of the standard?
In order to meet the Common Core state standards, I first reviewed which of the Common Core strands this lesson really fits into. But before I continued, I thought about which were the standards that I really want the students to be working on to build upon. So I had to reverse my thinking. The Common Core should be the foundation of what my course is progressing, how my course is progressing, and how their learning is progressing. So I started with a reading standard, and the reading was focused on annotating text, being able to understand complex language within a text, and that was essential for the first 2 days of this unit. It then was followed up by one of the writing standards that discusses how students are able to identify a claim in an author's writing and also be able to address the counterclaims presented. Finally, throughout the process, students were working in small groups, and that connected to the speaking and listening content standards, Common Core standards. And the speaking and listening was really focused around, are they able to effectively collaborate in a group setting?
Cool. Which of the core action indicators do you think this lesson best exemplifies and why?
I need to pause for that one.
Okay.
Sorry.
No?
I have to refresh my memory on the
Those are
core
the-
action. Roll with it.
Okay. Which of the core action indicators do you think this lesson best exemplifies and why?
This lesson really focuses on core actions 1 and 2, which address text-dependent, content-specific vocabulary, and it also focuses on student engagement with the texts. So the engagement piece was the critical component of the lessons, and that was what I really spent most of my time trying to address in the designing of the lessons. The core action indicators really helped to streamline my thinking. So they provided some examples of what this would look like in the classroom, and I used that as a guide towards designing my lessons.
We're interested in how the shifts required by the CCSS are being incorporated into your instruction. Discuss how this lesson illustrates the shifts required by the CCSS.
Okay. My unit on the Age of Enlightenment began. Pause. I'm going to start over again. Sorry.
Okay, yeah.
Let's start over
worries.
again.
You want me to read it or keep
Yes,
it?
please.
Okay, so we're interested in how the shifts required by the CCSS are being incorporated into the instruction. Discuss how this lesson illustrates the shifts required by the CCSS.
Okay. My unit on the Age of Enlightenment focused on text-dependent lessons. And I started my planning by first identifying what was the most critical learning for the Age of Enlightenment. And then I identified different texts from that era, specifically nonfiction texts, which is part of the instructional shifts and the changes in the Common Core, and identified those nonfiction texts that really targeted the essential learning for the Age of Enlightenment. I also wanted my lessons to be text dependent, and I wanted not just myself to focus on this, but the students as well. So I generated different gradual release models to show the students how my thinking is organized when I create text-dependent questions and text-dependent responses. Additionally, the students had to also work with content-specific vocabulary. And the vocabulary within these documents are very challenging. The reading level, if you look at the Lexile scores, was at the max for their expected grade level of reading. So it was a challenge, it was a push for them. But then going back to the Common Core, it's very important for students to talk it out with each other through the speaking and listening standards and be able to just collaborate and come to a greater understanding of some of those difficult passages.
How did you teach the content of this lesson prior to the CCSS? What is the same and what is different?
Prior to the Common Core State Standards, the CCSS, hold on one second. Okay, I had to really think about what I did. Prior to the CCSS, the Age of Enlightenment was taught as a continuation of some of the earlier units that we had discussed. And I focused more on the content of the course, not of the topic. I need to start over again.
Sure.
Okay.
Not a problem. Do you want me to read it?
Yes, please.
How did you teach the content of this lesson prior to the CCSS? What is the same and what is different?
Prior to the CCSS, I did not, hold on. I'm trying to figure out how I want to word this because I have the thinking in my mind.
Right.
Okay. Prior to the CCSS, the Age of Enlightenment was taught with an emphasis on the content, the who, what, where, when. And with the CCSS, it's forced people to really question the how and how these changes were occurring during the Enlightenment, how the Enlightenment was a revolution of thought, who was integral in this conversation during that time period. And rather than providing the students with the information, I really wanted them to struggle working through the texts that we've used this time with the CCSS and come to an understanding together and really identify what is the essential learning in each of the sources that they were studying, and what were the author's claims? What do those claims provide for us? Do they provide insight into some deeper understanding of this era? How can those claims all together be synthesized to show us something about this era?
Student engagement is crucial to the work of the CCSS. We want to understand how you ensured that all students had the opportunity to productively engage in the work of the lesson. How did you support all students in working with grade level text? For example, how did you provide scaffolding for students below grade level so they can read at grade level text?
In designing this lesson, engagement was a focal point for myself. First, I began by identifying what texts would be most appropriate for my students to be using. I did this by first looking at past texts that I had used that were nonfiction and were also rich in their vocabulary. And I ran them through a Lexile score that told me how challenging some of those texts would be. And looking at some of the bands in which students should be reading at, I also compared that data with the benchmark data from district assessments. So I knew that the students in my class, in my world history class, they all share a common interest in history because they have all decided to take the honors level course, which is what was videotaped. And even though they have this shared interest, they don't all have the shared level of understanding when they're reading, when they're writing, speaking, listening. So I looked back on their benchmark data to inform my decisions for assigning them to different groups. Engagement is not how fun a lesson is. It's not that the kids are smiling and laughing all the time. Engagement is that the students feel challenged and they want to engage in the lesson. They want to struggle, and that they're working through it and not giving up. That's engagement. I had assigned students to homogeneous group settings for analyzing the documents, and that was decided based on the benchmark data that I had analyzed, as well as my own personal observations in the classroom. That was for the analysis. Those students that struggled in their reading and analysis, I provided them with certain scaffolding, such as guiding questions through the reading to help direct and streamline their responses, their annotations. The other groups, I had just given them a list of guiding questions at the top of the source, not within the text. So it was much more independent, those that could handle and could succeed at that independence level. The next phase of this unit, I had then developed heterogeneous groups where there were mixed ability pairs. Students worked in mixed ability pairs to analyze the text further and in order to generate text-dependent questions. So when it comes to engagement, there are a lot of different facets. It's not just, engagement can also focus around, trying to get a starting point.
So you're talking about...
Yeah, sorry.
It's okay.
Engagement, I forget where I was going with it.
Do you want to move to the next
Yes.
question?
Yes,
Okay.
please.
Because you did talk about engagement in the last one
Yeah.
as well, which was really
Okay.
good. Okay, so moving on, how did you know the students were able to successfully respond to the text-dependent questions and tasks with precision? Did students acquire the literary skills addressed in the lesson?
I know that the students met the objective. And I know this because the students had worked on responding to text-dependent questions created by their peers using a Google Drive account. And as the students were collaborating together, as they can both add to the document when it is shared, I was able to walk around the room and identify some of the students that might need extra help in their supports of how to organize a response, to introduce what your response is, to then cite specific evidence from the text, and then to explain it and make sure that all components of their responses connect back to the text and are supported by the text. The students also completed a closure activity in this lesson where I asked them, how is the Enlightenment a revolution? Because we were running low on time, I had to modify that closure assessment because the students were not going to have enough time to look through the texts to support the responses. In the future, that is something that I would want to revise and make sure that they have the appropriate amount of time in order to complete the assignment to prove that they understand entirely how to use the text for their own individual assessments. Leading into this lesson, students also completed a reflection on our school webpage, our classroom school webpage, where I asked them which of the three authors that we studied, did they agree most. So in their responses, I told them they had to use at least 2 pieces of evidence to support their claims. And the objective of this overall unit was really for students to learn how the Enlightenment was a revolution of thought. I also wanted them to be able to learn how to craft text-dependent responses, text-dependent questions, and effective annotations. They reflected on their own work. I gave them a few different rubrics to look through and apply to their notes, their annotations, asking themselves, do my annotations address or highlight the author's claim? Do my annotations provide any insight into the author's claims? So they're really reflecting not only on what evidence they can use, but also how they respond to the text.
Okay. Let me pull this up. Okay. Good.
Is that it?
No.
Okay.
Not yet.
I was like, wow.
We're getting there.
Okay.
You only have a few more. Which behaviors from Core Action 3 did the students best exemplify in this lesson? And what actions?
Do you have that with you?
No, for correction 3.
Because I don't remember what's in it.
Or we can move to the next one.
Yeah, can we just move? Is
That's
that
fine.
okay?
Yeah,
All
we'll
right.
scratch that one. Okay.
Sorry.
Would you like to comment on any of the submitted student work? Was there something that delighted or surprised you?
After the second day of the unit, the students had to complete a reflection online where I asked them which of the 3 authors provide a claim that with which you most agree. While half of this question is text dependent, I also wanted to see that they're able to form an opinion. That is essential to their development, their intellectual development. In reading their responses, I found that some of the students did struggle to find the most important piece of evidence from the text to support what they were saying. For those students, I provided some remarks on their submitted assignment. I provided them with comments, suggestions, and they had to go back and revise their Moodle assignment. And Moodle is the forum on which they gave their responses. Also, I need you to repeat the question for me, please.
Would you like to comment on any of the submitted student work? Was there something that delighted or surprised you?
Thank you. The class leading up to this lesson, the students had to create text-dependent questions. I was a little nervous when looking over, I want to start over again. Leading up to this lesson, students had created text-dependent questions. And this was something that we had gone over in class, that I had modeled, they had worked on together in pairs, and had also written 3 on their own for homework. When writing the text-dependent questions, I found that many of the students were writing questions that required text. However, some of them seemed a little simple. So in our discussion in class, we had reviewed what makes a challenging text-dependent question. And we looked at some of the examples from their peers that had been written. And these were examples of strong text-dependent questions, that they had crafted them in a way that there was not just one part to the question, there might have been multiple parts to the question, such as which vocabulary word from the text best captures the author's claim. So it's a 2-part question where they would have to have evidence to prove the author's claim, but also what is the vocabulary word from that text, to be able to synthesize those 2. So once they had seen a few more models that their peers had written, it had shown improvement over their questions. I was very impressed by some of the questions that I had reviewed prior to this lesson. I said to the students that some of them were so great that I'd wish I had written them myself and could take credit for them, but I can't. So I was impressed by the work that they had completed. There were a few questions that needed some more tweaking. However, I think that after I review some of their responses and take some more time to look at the questions they had asked, I'll find that for the most part they did really grasp the idea of how to craft a strong question.
Great instructors are continuously learning. We want to understand what you celebrated in this lesson and what you would improve upon. Reflecting on the lesson, what worked well and what would you do differently?
In reflecting on this lesson, I feel that in reflecting on this lesson, I feel that there were some components that were really strong and others that I could improve upon in the future. First, the beginning of the lesson, the students were asked to discuss in pairs what challenges they faced in writing text-dependent questions. and how they worked to overcome some of those challenges. Those are very important questions, and the conversation could have gone on a little further. And I think that in the future, that's something that I really would want to build upon, that conversation. It's important for students to understand the process, the mental process. And we had talked about what the word metacognition means in class. So there was one student that referenced that word, which is a new term for them. And I've really focused on that idea of metacognition throughout this unit, thinking about the way they think. When students were working in pairs on answering the text-dependent questions, I feel that it was structured in a very organized fashion. I had already shared documents with them on Google. The way I had done that, first, the students wrote all the text-dependent questions the day before. I reviewed them, and they had about between 12 and 18 questions written. I knew that no students would be able to answer 12 to 18 text-dependent questions in one day. So I cut it down to 6, and I shared it with different groups for the next day. So it was very organized. I felt strong in my preparation for the class. However, also towards the end of the lesson, I feel that the closure question would be helpful to informing me about their understanding. But what would have maybe helped is to carry on another conversation about their experience during that class period in writing text-dependent responses.
This is the last one.
Okay.
Were there any surprises or unexpected student behaviors or reactions?
During the lesson, the students behaved appropriately. They were focused on the task at hand. They were very organized. They also had come to class prepared with all of their materials. So I did not run into any problems with students not being prepared for class or attentive during class. However, there were some issues with some of the technology in the classroom, and that's something that you just have to be able to be flexible with. And leading into this lesson, I had already printed out some backup copies in case for some reason the internet or the technology was not working for them for the lesson. Additionally, there were some students during our whole class discussion that had made some responses to the questions I had posed, and they were not on target. So what I had done was I always want to affirm what they're saying, because I don't want them to feel discouraged from participating in the future. So I'll usually work to try and help them come to what the correct response would be, or to help them understand the question better so that they can form a more accurate opinion.
You're done.
Thankfully.
Nice work.
All right. That was all right.
No, it was fine. It's all